The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to .NETCore.show/patrons. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast. The only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Progman Taylor, and this is episode 24, Migrating from ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core with Iris Classon. In this episode, I talk with Iris about the strategies that she has used to successfully migrate ASP.NET Framework applications over to ASP.NET Core, which she has written about in her upcoming book, Migrating ASP.NET Microservices to ASP.NET Core by Example. Some of you may know Iris from her website, her previous books, her work in the community as an MVP, her place on the .NET Foundation board, or her not-so-stupid questions videos. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. So the first thing I want to say, Iris, is thank you ever so much for being on the podcast. Everyone's living busy lives, but obviously with a tiny baby as well, I can't even imagine how much more busy your life has become.
Yeah, definitely things have changed a little bit, yeah.
I can't even imagine being a professional developer at this stage of my life if I were in your shoes and having a little one that's staying up and crying and screaming. And I hope you don't mind me saying, but I've seen that on Twitter and things you've been posting that, oh yeah, I've gone to this meetup with the little one and we're doing this activity. And I'm like, I couldn't do that.
Yeah, he's keeping me busy. I'm trying to keep him busy. I'm lucky because he really likes when it's there's a change in scenery. So if there's a lot of noise and noise, sounds and light and patterns and things. I mean, obviously he can't make out faces yet. He's only 10 weeks old. So it worked as a very nice trick to take him different places because he'd be very excited and happy about it and then completely wiped out when I got back home. So we got him into sleeping during the night quite early on, and I think probably the meetups bored him to sleep.
I think maybe that's where I went wrong then. I think if I ever have another one, I'll have to take them along to meetups.
When I try to get him to sleep, I'll walk around in the apartment and I go like SQL Server 2001. SQL Server 2008, and then I go like XML, even more XML, XAML, extended markup language, and it will actually work. He will fall asleep. It might be just my voice, but I like to think it's the words I'm saying that helps him sleep.
He'll end up obviously being the smartest programmer ever, obviously, being told all these things from day one.
Or he'll hate it.
So for the small number of people who listen to this show who may not know very much about you, I was wondering, could you give us a brief introduction about sort of who you are and the kind of work that you do and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, sure. God, I never know where to start with these introductions. My name is Iris Classon. I live in Sweden, but I've pretty much lived all over the world. I have a background in dietetics and personal training. For those who think that's a real job, I used to. And I did a career change later in life and decided I wanted to learn programming. So I am now a programmer and I work for a startup in Gothenburg. Definitely a back-end programmer, do a lot of DevOps stuff and cloud architecting, you could call it. And I'm an MVP and I'm very active in the community, very engaged. And I can definitely talk about myself for a long time, but I only do it because I'm nervous. So I'm going to let you ask some questions instead.
Okay, that's fair enough. Obviously doing a little bit of looking around and looking into the things that you've done as preparation for the podcast, I found that you do a series of not so stupid question videos. And I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit about those and how that came to be?
Oh, yes. Oh, the stupid questions. Yes. They used to be called just stupid question of the day, but then people didn't understand the irony because I didn't mean they were stupid. It all started when I was studying programming. I asked my teacher if he knew somebody I could do like an internship with and just sit with the programmers there one day a week and just, stare, learn, ask questions. And I was the first guy he paired me with was a little bit of a jackass. And He wasn't very nice, and he used to make fun of my so-called stupid questions. And I didn't think they were stupid because I was learning things, So I started that blog post series back in 2011, I believe, when he started calling my questions stupid. And turned out they weren't that stupid after all. So right back at you. He doesn't even know about the questions, obviously.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, one of the things that we should all try to remember is that there are no stupid questions.
We like to say there are no stupid questions, but if you look on Stack Overflow, they have quite a long wiki on how to ask questions. So we say there are no stupid questions, but we seem to have a lot of rules in regards to how to ask a question. And it's not so easy for some people, in particular if English is not their main language and they want to ask on Stack Overflow. And some people like to associate that if your English is not perfect, then it sort of reflects your intelligence, although you speak multiple languages. So there are a lot of people who do think that there are stupid questions, but I try to ignore them, and I hope people learn to ignore them and also learn to ask better questions, but at the same time rather ask a so-called stupid question than not asking at all.
Definitely. I hate when I'm sitting in a meeting and I could see everyone just sort of nodding their heads, and I'll go, okay, I'll be the idiot and ask the stupid question. What is this thing you're talking about? Can you just fill in the gaps a little bit? Because like you say, it's sometimes better to ask the question than it is to just sit there and nod and just, yes, I think I know what they're talking about, and get it completely wrong.
Don't you feel like sometimes it feels like a lot of people or some people seem to know everything? Another place I did an internship and actually ended up getting a job, .NET Mentor, really awesome company. And they had another intern, and he was like 1 year junior to me, if that's how you say it. And whenever we went through things, he would just go like, oh, yeah. And I was like, holy shit, he understands absolutely everything. I am so stupid. And then later on, when we were having lunch, I asked him, oh, so did you get all that? And he was like, no, I have no idea. And then I just realized he was just and because he didn't know what to do, and he didn't want to say that he didn't understand it. But I honestly thought he got everything, and I was feeling so stupid.
How do I put it? As we're recording this, there was a recent .NET Rocks episode where their guest was talking about how to educate developers and how to teach developers new tricks. And the guest that they had on said that we should all embrace stupidity, because we're all stupid at some point, and there's no way that we can know everything. We should embrace that idea of this mystery and ask the questions, regardless of how we worry that we'll come across, because there will be a time when, no matter how many years of experience you have, there'll be something that you don't know. I mean, it goes back to, there's a blog post by Scott Hanselman called, How Do You Know All This Crap? He was talking about how he was sitting with some engineers and they were saying, oh, yes, we need to draw, it was for a web app. We need to draw a circle with an X in it for the cancel button. So let's pull down the whole of Font Awesome and let's pull down all of these JavaScript libraries so we can draw this X in a circle. And he said, no, there must be a Unicode character to do this. And they were astounded, and they asked him, how do you know all this crap? And he said, well, it's just experience, isn't it? You learn these things as you go along. It's not that he sat there and read the entirety of all of the characters available in Unicode. He's just gone, there must be a character for it. Why don't we have a look there first? Rather than pulling down several 100 kilobytes of dependencies, we can use this 1 byte character.
The amount of information out there, in particular as a programmer, is overwhelming. I went back to the school where I studied, and I did a lecture on how to stay up to date as a developer and so on. And one of the questions I got is, how much time do you spend just to stay up to date? I'm the wrong person to ask because I'm a little bit of a fanatic when it comes to programming, and I spend way too much time trying to stay up to date. But I decided to ask on Twitter how much time people spend besides work just to stay up to date, stay current. It was like 7% said they didn't spend any time, they got everything done at work, and then they went home and were happy. And then I think about 40% said up to 4 hours, and then another 38% said up to 10 hours. And there was like 15% that said they spent more than 10 hours a week just to stay up to date. And it just makes me wonder, like, do they do that in other professions, or is it just programming? No wonder people feel stupid if they don't spend that much time, if some people do it. So I don't even know where the responsibility lies. Is it the workplace that helps you stay up to date? Are you supposed to invest so much time? Are you stupid if you don't? How do you accumulate all this information? Because you're never going to catch up with everything that's out there.
My personal feeling is that, like, you should, if you have the chance. Not everyone has the time to spend hours and hours keeping up to date, but then you could have maybe 2 or 3 people who you work with who will do that and then disseminate the information. Because there's nothing wrong with being a 9 to 5 developer, someone who turns up at 9, works until it's time to go home, and then doesn't do anything in development at all. I've known people who are full-time developers, and then in their own time, they're working as chefs. They're doing cooking for other people because it brings them joy. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's fine. Do what makes you happy, you know? Because at the end of the day, you've got to look after yourself.
I had a colleague like that, Tobias. He was a really good developer, like one of the best developers I've worked with. And at 5 p.m., he closes the lid on his laptop and he goes home. Unless the build server or the production machines are literally on fire, they're virtual, so I guess that's not going to happen. Unless there's an actual fire, he probably would not open his laptop again. And I have tremendous respect for that. He's got such a good balance. And sometimes I wish more of my colleagues had that, because I've had several colleagues burn out and it can take years to recover.
Yeah, it really can. It really can. I was speaking to someone at a local meetup only a few weeks back, and he said, I'm done with doing conferences. I'm done with doing talking, because for the last year, I believe, was doing a different conference or different meetup or a different talk almost every week. And he's saying to me, oh, I've got to fly out to Europe in 2 weeks, and I just can't because I'm so tired. But I've already made plans to meet other people while I'm there. And it is tiring to constantly be on the move. You know, you've got to find the time to relax.
I do feel like there's a pressure that you have to spend your own time to stay current. You know, the complexity of software increasing, more frameworks, every single day. There's like a static site that day since last JavaScript framework, and it's just a static 0. I checked the markup, it's just a 0, because just going to assume always going to be new frameworks. There's a lot of pressure. And if you additionally have the pressure of feeling stupid for asking questions, that's a problem.
I feel as though sometimes, though, that's more of a environment thing, maybe a company culture thing. And like I say, we should all embrace the stupid anyway, It's better to ask a question that may seem stupid and get a definite answer, or get somewhere where you can, oh, right, okay, so I need to be Google Binging for this particular topic to learn more about this thing. Or it's better to do that than to sort of fumble through and then realize it's been 2 hours and you've gotten nowhere.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Related to that then, I didn't even realize it would be related when I was planning the questions, but related to that then, we've seen a lot of folks in the technology space coming from, and I don't really want to say it like this, but non-traditional backgrounds. By that, I mean people who haven't had a computer science or software engineering background, haven't gone to boot camps, haven't gone to college, university and studied those things. They've maybe decided, I don't want to be an investment banker now. I'm going to learn how to do development in my own time and transition over. And from what I understand, obviously you mentioned it earlier on, you came from a sort of clinical dietitian background and moved into development. But you didn't just move into it, you seem to have moved into it and gone from 0 to 100% and done more than some folks can achieve in multiple years in a single year. Could you tell us a little bit about that? I know that there's a lot of stress involved with, I have to learn all the things, and especially if you're sitting with people and they're making you feel stupid, that's not good.
Well, where do I begin? This can be a very long story or a shorter one. The short answer is I was so excited when I found programming because it was just so right for me. And after years and years of sort of feeling out of place and feeling like I didn't belong anywhere, I just hadn't found my community, I suddenly came across something that I was extremely passionate about. And I was sharing this passion with other people that were equally passionate about programming. And it's just like I had been homeless my whole life and finally got myself a home. So I wanted to move in. So, I mean, I brought all my boxes. I bought loads of furniture. I assembled more IKEA furniture than any other person. No, I was so excited. I just wanted to inhale everything at once. It maybe sounds a little bit weird. I do have ADHD. That probably helped a little bit because I can certainly hyper focus on something, and I did in the beginning. But mostly it was finally feeling at home and being able to release all this energy I had inside of me, just ready to embrace something that I was really passionate about, where people also gave back appreciation for, having another community member that was passionate. It was really life-changing for me, and it still is. I'm incredibly happy to be a programmer.
Fantastic. All I can say is it's great to have another person in the team. Like you say, we're a huge community and, we all want to help each other out. We all want to achieve the same goals. The more the merrier. That's how I see it.
And I do like that a lot of people have different backgrounds. I mean, we live so long now, do have time for several careers, if you want to. The word career is sort of loaded because it sounds like you have to be like a go-getter with sharp elbows. But I mean, we live for a long time. Gone are the days where you got a golden watch because you worked in the same place for 50 years. Now people look at you like you're weird if you work in the same place doing the same thing for 50 years. We have a lot of time to try different things. And as our personality evolves, you can sort of try new things and evolve with that. And I think that's bloody awesome.
Yeah, I was talking to someone the other day and they'd said that they'd spent 10 years at a company, and I said, how have you survived? I suppose for some of the really big companies like the Microsofts and the Googles, you can expect people to stick around for a very long time. But with it being so easy to start a company and get a product out there, we've become, I think, more of a startup culture, which is a good thing and a bad thing. But it also means that, like you say, it's so much easier to work for someone for a year, 2 years, and then move on because you're not tied down anymore.
I think that's a good thing because you want to have, a little bit of freshness. And I think in larger companies, you can try on different roles, different teams, different products. But in the smaller companies, I think it helps getting in a new person. I'm just worried that the team will sort of become a little bit too stale if it's the same people doing the same things for, long time.
No, I totally agree. It's too easy to fall into the trap of, well, we'll use this particular architecture with this technology to solve this problem. And then the customer comes to you with something that would not necessarily would require a different technology stack, but it may run better or may be easier to develop, may yield better results to do it in a different technology stack. And when your employees go, yes, we'll use the same architecture, the same technology stack, and the same process.
Yeah, so it's like, hey, we got a toolbox and it consists like a bunch of hammers.
Yeah, right.
It's like in a team, it's like a family or close friends. I mean, you spend probably more time than you spend with your family, unfortunately. And I think like you sort of become synchronized and you become more and more similar, unless, you have a lot of conflict, obviously. But I felt this before, that in a team that you start sort of adapting to each other so much that it's very difficult to get new ideas out. And at some point you sort of just give up and give in, and you just reach for the same tool each time just to get shit done. And with, the overwhelming amount of information out there, you just cannot be bothered taking aboard another framework or, God forbid, do another migration.
Definitely. I was talking to someone about JavaScript frameworks, and we were talking about Angular and React and Ember and Vue and all of these things. And I said, but what you've done with your React is you've mixed all of this HTML and CSS into JavaScript. So when you want to migrate to a different framework, it's not going to be easy at all. You're going to have to rebuild the entirety of your UI rather than just swap a library and change a few things. It's going to be a complete rewrite.
Yeah.
Migration is hard. Talking about migrations then, we've connected a few days ago and you've talked to me about you have a new book coming out that is all about migrating ASP.NET services to ASP.NET Core. And that should be out sometime soon after this episode goes out. And I was just wondering, could we maybe talk about about that book, if that's okay.
Absolutely. It's been very interesting writing this book. In particular, when you start writing this book while you're on an early version of ASP.NET Core, like Project JSON file, early version, and then a few tiny changes come out. And I've done this before. The first book I co-authored, we wrote Windows Store apps. They were called Windows Store apps back then. And, we were pretty much done. And then Windows 8.1 came out with a minor update to the store apps. And we had to rewrite basically the whole book. So I'm just having like a deja vu writing this book now. It's just writing about technology in general, unless you're writing of something that's never going to change. It can be such a pain. And this one has been challenging because I'm a little bit late.
I remember when I talked to Andrew Locke on the podcast, he's written a book for Manning Publishing called ASP.NET in Action.
Yeah.
And he said one of the biggest problems he had was, like you, he started writing the book when version 1 was out, and they had Project JSON and they had a whole bunch of stuff. And then they dropped Project JSON, which meant he had to rewrite everything he'd written up to that point. And then they went, let's change a few things and release version 2. And then he had to rewrite a whole swathe of stuff in the book.
Well, at least he's not writing about Azure, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Oh god, yeah. ASP.NET Core certainly had some challenges in the beginning, and there are a lot of benefits, but there are some downsides. And one downside to being a popular and now open source framework is that everybody has an opinion and they're very happy to share it, which means there will be change because people will not accept that you just keep things the way they've always been if it's not, considered best practice. So discussions end up with people wanting to change things, and you have, the not so popular breaking changes.
Luckily, I've managed to avoid all of those so far. Most of the stuff that I've worked on in ASP.NET Core has been me sort of building things or building things for talks. But I did sort of scaffold an entire framework for the company that I work for, that they push a button and then, it's essentially a .NET new template, but it does most of the stuff for you. It sets up cores, it sets up secure headers, all that kind of stuff. That took a while. That's good. But then, like you say, breaking changes, for a while, global JSON was the way to go because the SDK wasn't evolving so fast. And then they went, actually, the SDKs and the runtimes are evolving way too quickly. Drop that quick. Just get rid of it.
So I don't know if you know, or if a lot of people know, that there is actually a repository called Announcements, where you can see all the issues that are announcements and breaking changes. So actually they have labels, breaking changes and announcements. So you can subscribe to the repository and you will only get notifications about announcements and breaking changes, compared to if you subscribe to another repository and you get announcements about absolutely everything and you're never going to check your email again. So I highly recommend that people do that if you use ASP.NET Core, because you want to sort of know ahead if there's a breaking change coming, because there's going to be more.
Like you say, it's a good idea to keep an eye on these changes, because you don't want to get to a point where you're almost ready to ship an app and then they release an update. Like with your book, you're almost ready to ship the book. They release some kind of update and everything's now invalidated.
Yeah. And I just hope there's not going to be more surprises. Obviously, I have a lot of contact with the team and so on. So I'm staying ahead of the game. But I still had a few surprises I didn't expect, actually. One of them was that so early on, they would say that they would not support the full .NET framework with ASP.NET Core. I thought that would come out later than 3.0. So that one caught me actually a little bit by surprise. And I had to go and sort of change things a little bit in the book.
As we were recording, it was only recently that they said that ASP.NET Core on top of .NET Framework for .NET Core 2.2 will be supported indefinitely. But everything after that, no. If you want to do ASP.NET Core 3, it has to be .NET Core 3.
Yeah, if you go to the support side, though, it won't say indefinitely.
Oh, right. Maybe I'm operating on old information then.
One of the team members said that, but the support side, maybe they're not allowed to write that on the support page, because there's a lot of liability promising something like that. I'll never break up with you. It's you and me forever and ever and ever. All relationships come to an end, at some point. So, yeah.
So if we talk about the book a little bit, if that's okay. So do you have a hard and fast rule for when you should migrate an ASP.NET service over to ASP.NET Core? Or is it more a case of a gut feeling? Or is it more a case of your boss has heard of some great new technology called ASP.NET Core, and that's all they'll talk about, and now we've got to migrate over?
I would say when the pros outweigh the cons, and now people are going to say, yeah, well, duh, of course. Well, what I would say, if some of the benefits seems very interesting, say that performance is extremely important to the service that you're working on, and you've tweaked everything else, and you really need this extra bit of performance, or you have some other specific reason, what I would do is I would go ahead and do an analysis before actually deciding to migrate. So first do an analysis, and they have a portability tool that you can use, which is quite helpful, but you will still need to manually go through the result and sort of do some pros and cons. That you might have some dependencies that is going to be a lot of work to replace. You might have some deal breakers and so on. So the answer to whether or not you should migrate depends upon the result of doing a proper analysis. And if you decide to migrate, you can start off by just migrating a tiny part. You don't need to migrate everything at once. And the problem I've seen is that when you see examples of doing a migration, a lot of people do sort of like pretend projects, let's pretend we have a web shop. My web shop has 3 files, and now we're going to migrate. So we do new project, we pull over the file and we update the reference, and voila, look how easy this is. Obviously, that is not very realistic. The startup I work for, I've actually used our actual production code as an example, parts of it. Although there are some microservices, we also have sort of a distributed monolith going on. So we have challenges that if you want to migrate one service, you have to migrate some of our internal dependencies that are dependencies on other services that you do not want to migrate. So you have this cascade of migrations that you need to do with your dependencies. And that's a little bit more challenging. So you can actually start off by just migrating a smaller part, breaking out something from a service and make it a microservice, or you just decide on migrating one out of your many services and then making all the dependencies .NET standard libraries, unless you have some dependencies that makes it hard to do that. And then you have to sort of manage compiling for different platforms.
So let's say you've done your analysis on a small service. Now, obviously, as you've said, when people have been showing this off, it's a case of, I have this tiny project and I change some files and it just works.
Yeah.
Is it a case of that with, let's say I have a bunch of microservices and I want to take one of them out and replace it with an ASP.NET Core microservice? Is it a case of, I just change a few lines of the CS project, I add some references, and then I stay in NuGet hell for weeks, and then eventually I hit build one morning and it just works?
You could be incredibly lucky and be able to do that. Most likely, there's going to be more work involved because most microservices I've seen will still have some dependencies on some internal libraries that are going to be used somewhere else in the project. And the question then becomes, how do you manage those and how do you test them? Because you need to test both for .NET Core and also for the full .NET framework if those libraries are used in projects that use .NET framework and not .NET Core. So there are certainly more things you need to think about than just simply creating a new project file and pulling over new references for new NuGet packages. And also, another important thing to think about is the architecture is, in my opinion, although it's loosely coupled, modular, and so on, it's still a little bit more opinionated than I guess you can call the old ASP.NET, because they are certainly trying very hard to encourage what a lot of people consider best practices. So you have to sort of make your conventions sort of align with them as well if you really want to benefit from a lot of the things that come with ASP.NET Core. So when you decide on doing a migration, you have quite a few things you need to think about and make some decisions. How you want to deploy, which conventions you're going to take on board. You'll have to rewrite some parts of the authentication and authorization and so on. So you're basically moving over to not a whole new concept, but a very opinionated framework with a lot of good practices that you might not have used before. And it's sort of going to look a little bit weird if you just migrate your code as is and you try very hard not to use the new good things that come with it.
So let's say I've taken some time and I want to replace some ASP.NET stuff with ASP.NET Core. And I want to put this to my boss and I say, look, boss, you want me to swap this over. I've done an analysis. I've separated out some of our concerns. I've looked at NuGet packages and internal libraries that we use. And the boss says to me, how long is it going to take, Jimmy? So how long is it going to take, Iris?
Oh, it's going to take forever. No, actually, I thought it would be a lot of work for us to migrate because we have dependencies between services that are not supposed to be there. And we use a lot of funky, outdated libraries and so on. And I couldn't easily find any NuGet replacements for those. But it turns out once you get started migrated, it actually gets a little bit easier because you get into a flow. And now is better than earlier. So we migrated quite early on. And at the time, although .NET Core had great support, there was still a lot of NuGet packages that were lagging behind. But nowadays, most NuGet packages do support at least .NET standard, and that helps a lot. It's not as much work as I thought it would be, but exactly how much, putting a time on it, estimating is one of the hardest things in programming. So that's very difficult to estimate. If you start off by migrating one service, if you have several services, I guess you could use that as a reference point. But it does get easier if you have shared dependencies and you migrate those to .NET Standard. At some point, you have migrated most of the shared dependencies, and the only thing you have left is the actually ASP.NET service itself. And migrating just the service itself and not the dependencies and, the tests and all that, that's not a lot of work, honestly.
Okay, so you're saying it depends a little bit on your design, I guess, how you've architected all of your services together. And it also depends on how much of that code you can share in a .NET Standard library. And like you say, as you start going, it will be a monumental task when you start. But as you keep chipping away at it, you'll get to the end faster, I guess.
Yes. And I always say, always grab a dependency graph. There are different tools you can use for that. I used ReSharper. And you start with the leaves because the outermost dependencies usually are the ones who have the least amount of third-party dependencies and are easiest to migrate. And then you sort of work your way in towards the service. Unless you're lucky and your ASP.NET service is quite lightweight and doesn't have a lot of external dependencies, then I guess it's much easier.
So we've talked about the process of migrating, how you can estimate how long that's going to take. So let's say I don't have a microservice. Let's say I have a business line app that's been around for 10 years, and then my boss says to me, right, convert it over to ASP.NET Core, go. Is there a plan? Is there a gut feeling that you have for how do I split up this monolithic application and convert it over to ASP.NET Core? Do I want to split it up? Do I want to attack it all at once? What would be your advice?
My first question would be why? Really got to make sure you know why you want to do this, because ASP.NET is not going to, vanish overnight. It's going to be around for a long time. So it's not like you're sitting, on a ship that already sailed if you're still maintaining an ASP.NET solution. If, however, you're convinced that you really want to do it and, there's a lot of benefits in doing so and, you weigh the pros and cons and you've decided, okay, I'm going to do it. And then you've done your analysis. If you're going to migrate a monolithic service, please consider looking into, could this be split into at least a couple of services? There might be reasons why you don't want to do that, because obviously managing a lot of services can also be challenging. Maybe you have a monolith that works really well, but you could try to just break out a little part into a service and sort of get a feel for it, setting up the continuous integration and deployment pipeline and see if that works, if it does work, and then migrate the rest of it. I would be very hesitant embarking on a very large migration without really having considered it properly first and also given it a try. Because I found a lot of the things that we thought we wanted to migrate a service for, such as, oh God, this is perfect for containers because it's so small, modular, lightweight. We didn't end up using that. And there were other benefits that we hadn't considered instead. And we wouldn't have known that if we hadn't tried sort of selecting a few services first and migrating them and also breaking out some pieces that could be independent services. That's how I would recommend going about it. But start with asking the question, why? don't do it just because it's new and juicy and sexy. That's not good enough a reason.
I was going to ask if we could go back to the why, just because it is a very important point to make. You don't want to just convert because, or just migrate, just because you can migrate. You want to pick the time that works and pick a technology that works. If the app is already running and it's already running really well, and like you said earlier on towards the beginning of the conversation, if you're not seeing a reason to upgrade, maybe you don't need the extra performance, maybe you don't need the things that ASP.NET Core can give you, like the cross-platform, then why are you looking to those?
Exactly. And also in terms of performance, you might want to do some benchmarking first. And maybe the performance is not so much in the web service itself. Maybe the performance is more in code, and you can still benefit and leverage that without having to migrate to another ASP.NET framework. So, if it's performance, do benchmarking and consider other places. If it's you like the new architecture, well, we've been using dependency injection way before this came around. And, you can do that independently. And if you modularity, you can still have a modular service without having to use ASP.NET. The argument is that you want a flexible deployment model, but that's completely different. But I know cross-platform sounds really good, but not everybody is going to actually use that. And you don't want to do it just in case. So you want to make sure that you actually have a plan. If you know that you are going to deploy to, different operating system, then okay, but you don't want to do it so you can have the option in the future. Because when the future comes, maybe there's another framework around that you want to use instead. Maybe you're not even working on the same system anymore. So don't do that.
Sure. And just to back up a few points there, obviously the majority of people in our age bracket, I guess, that are .NET developers are primarily Windows developers.
Yeah.
Not only do you need to learn ASP.NET Core, but you also need to learn the differences between Windows and a Unix-like operating system. If you are going to go cross-platform, you need to understand the differences, and you need to understand the different paradigms and the different ideas that were used to generate these two operating systems. And, you mentioned obviously containers as well. You don't want to just jump to, let's move to ASP.NET Core and do containers and do orchestration and do this and do that. Because that's way too many things, right?
Yeah, if you want to use containers are awesome. We can talk about that for another hour, but you can start by just lift and shift, to containers, the system as is, and try out containers separately without, putting in a migration in the mix. So just one thing at a time. So look at the reasons first and see if there's another way to achieve that besides doing a full migration.
Definitely. I mean, ASP.NET Core is really mature now anyway, but it's still an early version. Like you were saying earlier on, there are some people who will work on it who are very opinionated and bring that opinionated state of mind to the development of ASP.NET Core. The same thing could be said for Node. The same thing could be said for React. The same thing could be said for Ruby on Rails, PHP, all of these technologies. Maybe not jumping across whilst there is still that process of maybe we should do it this way, maybe we should do it that way going on.
There's a lot of value in using a mature framework, and ASP.NET, not ASP.NET Core. ASP.NET is very mature. It's tried, it's tested, it's being used heavily, and there's a lot of benefit from using a mature framework. Just documentation, just look at Stack Overflow, the amount of questions and answers. So, one of the downsides with jumping on something new is, documentation is going to be a little bit frustrating to navigate because you have the different versions. There's going to be lack of documentation. The forums aren't as busy and so on. So maturity, is something people tend to ignore when something new and juicy comes out. But maturity is what allows us sometimes to develop software faster because there's already so many questions answered.
Definitely. Like you said earlier on, it's not like ASP.NET framework is going anywhere. So looking at swapping out your entire system for something that's brand new and shiny when the thing that is brand new and shiny is literally brand new may not be the best idea.
Yeah, the grass isn't always greener either.
Definitely. Other than what we've talked about today, are there any other top tips that you could think of for migrating an application? And obviously, we're not saying don't do it.
No, buy my book and then do it. Well, I have some advice. First of all, If you're going to use ASP.NET Core, you really want to stay up to date because it's going to keep changing, and it's changing at a quite rapid pace compared to other more mature frameworks that really are pretty much done in terms of how much they're going to evolve. So you want to make sure that you are engaged, and maybe you can share the links. I have a few links I can give to you. Obviously, subscribe to the repositories. Keep an eye on announcements. There are various stand-up videos that you can watch. Obviously, you have this podcast, which is awesome. And the ASP.NET team is very active on Twitter, and they will actually answer questions, and do not be afraid to ask questions or to submit issues to the repositories. So that would be my main advice. And even if you decide, okay, I'm not going to migrate right now, you still want to keep an eye on this. And I would still take a look at the repository, because there are a lot of really, really good architectural discussions going on in the different issues. And I've learned a lot from that, even before we decided to migrate. That would be my parting recommendations, I guess.
What I'll do is I'll get the list of links from you, any links that you want to send out, and I'll make sure that they're in the show notes. Do you know roughly the release date of your book, or maybe what the title is going to be? I know you said earlier on that you have a goal in mind for when you want to release it, but I just thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about it and where we can get it from.
The book is going to be published with Iris, and we're aiming for build, which is in May. I don't know exactly when in May. I think it's the beginning of May. I've finished the book, so I'm just formatting stuff now and just looking over things. And everything has been approved by technical review and so on. So it is done. And then the money is going to come rolling in. No, you don't make money on books, really. But that's a different story.
So have you got a finished title for it, or is there still a work in progress on the title?
Well, the working title is Migrating ASP.NET Microservices to ASP.NET Core by Example. It's a bit long. We're probably going to go for something like that.
So then just a couple of last few questions about the book then. Because it's by example, does that mean that you've written some applications already that you are showing off how to move across?
I'm actually using production code, which is awesome. And yes, I did ask work first. So we got some code that, I'm less than proud of, but I wanted to use real code and a real example. So it's actually a part of our system that is used as an example. And I didn't try to make it pretty before I pulled it in. The example is quite realistic, which hopefully will help people, because I think it's very common scenarios that we're struggling with that I'm showcasing in the book.
Okay, so is it one example of migrating one set of services, or is it a couple of disparate examples that are, here's how you might do it for a web shop, here's how you might do it for an authentication service?
First of all, I'm not doing any front-end migration, because that's definitely not my area of expertise, and we don't render our front-end from the server side. That's completely independent to clients. So it's a slice of our systems. I'm actually migrating a few services with shared dependencies. And some of the dependencies have to support .NET framework as well. So we have to have tests for both. One service is migrated as a whole. One service, we're breaking out a little part, showing examples of how to replace NuGet packages with new packages, and how also to work around things where you don't have that opportunity. And I'm also covering how you can use, for example, conditional compilation and other hacks that are, maybe sometimes a little bit questionable if you really need to support code for different platforms.
Okay, I see. So it is really, like you say, a real example, like how most of the people who will be buying the book will be thinking of migrating their services.
Yeah. For example, before we do the analysis, I just go through, basically you want to remove all your dependencies that you don't use, you want to remove. And I remember there's actually an example in the book where I do a quick analysis to find out if there are any dependencies that we actually don't use. And I found heaps of code that we don't use anywhere in the project. So I even show those types of examples. How, first of all, you want to go through the solution and clean out unnecessary and unused dependencies, be that, classes and members and actual dependencies assemblies. So I'm not scared to show the ugly parts of the code, because we all have it. And that's where you need to start, actually. We can't pretend you're migrating from a greenfield to a greenfield, because that's not going to work when you try to apply this to a real life scenario.
Fantastic. That definitely sounds like something I want to read. Not just because it's .NET Core, but, it sounds like even if you're migrating, you could maybe apply the same principles to if you decide to migrate away from ASP.NET Framework or any of the Microsoft technology stacks, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And, if not anything else, it's at least an interesting read because it's always fun to look at somebody else's production code. Because I think deep down inside, we're all curious, like, how does your code look like? How do you do things? I know I am. And the source code is available and everything.
Oh, wow. I definitely will be checking that out once it's out. So that's migrating ASP.NET microservices to ASP.NET Core by example.
Yes.
And you're hoping for May, around MS Build.
Yes, that's what I'm hoping for.
So if the podcast goes out after then, I'll obviously try to get a direct link from you to put into the show notes. But if it goes up before then, listeners, you need to be looking out for this book. So just a few more questions, if that's all right. I always ask these questions at the end of the podcast. How can people maybe find out more about you and the work you're doing, or maybe connect with you to talk about things that you're interested in, or maybe like your YouTube channel, things like that?
Yeah, well, the easiest way to get a hold of me is on Twitter, Iris Classon. I have my blog, which is irisclasson.com. And my stupid questions are published there as well as on YouTube. So I do both a blog post and a video. And those are the places I'm the most active. And you'll find me at various user groups and conferences. But Twitter is the easiest way to get a hold of me. I can be very slow replying to emails.
I think that's the same with all of us. Like you're saying, you said earlier on about if you subscribe to the wrong GitHub repositories, you end up not checking your emails ever again. I could totally understand that.
And I've also learned that if you're too quick to reply to emails, more will come. Email Iris, she replies straight away. But now everybody thinks like, oh gosh, she never checks her email. I'm just not going to even bother emailing her, which is excellent. Less emails for me.
I like that. I may have to start practicing that myself. Thank you ever so much for being on the podcast, Iris. I appreciate that it's getting quite late where you are anyway, because we're in different time zones, so I can appreciate that. And I can totally appreciate and thank you very much for taking the time out to be on the show. And I can't wait to read this book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. That was my interview with Iris Classon. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice, and to come back next time for more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks.